Welcome, everyone. I'm Sharon Raji Maynard, and I'm here with Bree Benjaman, and so thrilled to have her with our Deep Roots series. This is a series that is sponsored by my Patreon community, and so thank you, Patreon community, that allows me to have conversations with women doing amazing things, bringing new ideas to the table, and we so need it in this time. So welcome to everyone who's with us and those who will be watching and listening after from the recordings. We really appreciate your presence at that point in time. So I'm here with Bree Greenberg Benjaman, and the thing that really excited me about her work is she is a mental health professional. And she is the founder of the Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy that opened in 2010. And I want to talk to Bree about integrative therapy because as an energy worker, I've been working in the unseen to make changes in the seen. So I do spiritual healing. And I'm very clear that we need more than one focus in our multidimensional self. And so, Bree, I want maybe to begin this conversation to see how you speak of and used integrative therapy. Because for me, it was, here I am, I can do energy work on you, which impacts your spiritual. It certainly can impact the emotional, mental, and physical body too. But there are other processes that might be more directly impactful in the physical, more impactful in the emotional, in the mental. And I encourage my clients to always look for all of those processes to put them together. So that was the way I looked at integrated. But speak to us about your clinic, how it can be, and what it is what it is that you found in what you call integrative therapy. So welcome, first of all. Glad you're here. Glad I found you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. And this is like a subject that I love to talk about. So I'm excited to be able to talk about it. So as you were saying all of that, I think a couple things really hit me. One, and I'll see if I can remember all of them because a lot was coming up for me. So one of them is that when we started the clinic back in 2010, there really wasn't a word integrated. Back in 2010, the clinic was actually the Vermont Center for Yoga and Therapy. And that was really derived from my experience as a yogi and as a longtime meditator who was also a psychotherapist, and recognizing a long time that there needed to be the presence of both spiritual and somatic work in the treatment of the clients that I was seeing. So I had kind of found the fundamental edges that psychotherapy was able to prime. And at that time, which is a long time ago, 12, 13 years ago, I was recognizing that some of these other interventions could bring people to different states within themselves that could allow for more receptivity for some of the psychotherapy work. Now I understand a much more complex understanding than I did then. I didn't even understand the full depth of multiplicity. I understood multiplicity in the psyche or personal psychology realm, but I really didn't understand multidimensionality quite the same way. So I've grown into my understanding over the years too. So when we started, integrative wasn't a thing. Back then it was really about taking what was considered alternative medicine and combining it with conventional medicine. And so we brought in those things, but I always brought them in with this deep level of interest and curiosity, and thinking about the idea that each intervention, whatever it was going to have a specific reverberation in that individual's personal and collective family and societal system. And so at the beginning, we were using things that I knew worked in formulas that worked. And then within a couple of years, we kind of graduated to being more experimental. We brought in different kinds of practitioners. We moved from being yoga and therapy to integrative therapy. And we started looking at different ways of combining modalities intentionally to be able to meet what was happening inside of somebody. And that I see as being very different even than what we have now that we call integrative. So even in this day, 10 years later, we have this buzzword of being integrative, which is how, kind of the old school alternative medicine has dropped off, and now we call it integrative care, which encompasses this wide version of different kinds of care. But if you go to an integrative clinic, you typically have 4 or 5 different modalities who may or may not understand each other's language. They may or may not cooperate at all around care. They may or may not have any true depth of understanding of each other. So I think it's like a step towards what I did at the clinic, but still is really not what we did. What we did is we brought people in, we did an integrated intake. So we looked at a 5-body assessment of where that person was. We looked at their dream life. We looked at their breathing. We looked at their somatics. We looked at their ancestral history, their personal psychology. We looked at the ways in which they moved physiologically. And at that point, we curated care for them. And we would start that care with a particular team. And then as they move through care, we would keep moving that team with them. So somebody might come in and they might say, I have lifelong anxiety and I need therapy. And we would do the initial intake and I would say, I really actually don't think therapy is going to be that helpful for you, because you can run circles around a psychotherapist because you've had like 2 decades full of CBT and DBT psychotherapy. And so I'd be more likely to put that person into a nervous system balancing place and then add the psychotherapy piece in later when they were able to modulate their nervous system and land in their bodies a little bit more. Or we may find out in the intake that there's this terrible trauma that happened several generations back, and that's never been looked at, and it's reverberating in the echo of this individual, and no one's looked at the ancestral piece because they're so focused on that person's anxiety. And so in that way, I really think that what we did is still not fully being done. And a part of that is because we haven't developed centralized models that have a unified field of understanding and a unified way of actually practicing. So it's not just like you and I may have a very similar way of orienting, but our practice and the way we go about it might be very, very different. And if you have somebody who's already very fractured, that actually increases the fracturing. And there's this part of them that then is trying to manage all these different lenses and all these different messages. You know, the body worker is saying, you need more self-care. And the psychotherapist is saying, we need to find that part of you that's been in exile for 2 decades. And the ancestral healing person is saying, that's not your part. That's Sam back 30, generations ago. And so I think when that happens, your head starts spinning and you're already really struggling to stay coherent. And so this model really increases coherence. And it also increases the possibility that in the quantum field of the practitioners, healing is happening for the client, even when they're not in the room. And that's something that when I developed this model, I never expected to happen or even understood could happen, and just started organically happening. And that's a whole other level of healing, as you know. So that's a very long answer to what you asked.
No, and it's exactly what I've seen. It's exactly what I've seen that's missing. And that's why I was so excited to even know a little bit about what you were up to. In my second book, called The Ancient Ones Give Warning, Heeding the Cries of Your Children, one of the characters in the book is putting together a group just like what you're doing. Yes. But you've done it, and that's what's so valuable to me, and how you've explained it is really amazing. When we live in systems, and we do, and we live in systems and we don't fit in any of the systems, one of the bits of information that you shared, because I am not an empath. I would not call myself an emotional sensitive or even a mental sensitive, but I'm not an empath. But I do know people who are. And you were saying in an experience when you are, let's just use that terminology and that kind of experience. And here you are, you're going through life with this additional piece of sensory information, a gift, but you don't know it's a gift, because in our society, that sensitivity is not at all addressed. In fact, it's downplayed. What happens? How is a person left when they have this amazing gift, but they don't know it's a gift? Where does that take them?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the mental health system, that's been really problematic for a long time, because what it looks like is codependency and borderline personality disorder, or sometimes bipolar. And so there's, and sometimes clinical depression, or all three. And so we really have not made room for this understanding. It's just barely starting to come on the scene. I think that Elaine Aron, who wrote The Highly Sensitive Person, I want to say, I don't even know how old that book is now, but it's somewhere between 7 to 10 years old. And I think that when that came on the scene, it was kind of groundbreaking for the therapeutic community to recognize that there was this sensitivity piece. But there's a whole other layer in there, which is that a lot of people who are empathic also have deep spiritual sensitivity. And so it's not just sensitivity to the humans around them, it's sensitivity in the non-human realm. And whether that be the animal realm or the ancestral realm or the realm of spirit with angels or guides. And we call that crazy in Western medicine. And we label it as schizophrenia or any of these other things, and we medicate the hell out of it. And when you medicate somebody who is already very sensitive, not only does it really depress them because it suppresses, oftentimes, not always, sometimes medication is helpful and needed, but it often suppresses their life force. And it also identifies them with this identity of brokenness, which they have often already carried for a long period of their life, just feeling other because of their sensitivities and feeling outside of the regular world. And when the professional world does that, the professional world kind of amplifies that label, because we look to the professional world for our sense of what's true and what isn't true. It's a reference point for our wellness in so many ways. And so when the psychotherapeutic world does that to people, it actually just makes them more disabled. And I believe, and I have seen over the years, that those people tend to go from practitioner to practitioner for many, many years, in and out of addiction diagnoses, depression diagnoses, serious mental health and personality disorder diagnoses. And somewhere in there, we always know when it's wrong. We know when it's not true for us. And it's hard to know that it's not true and have no professional backing for that. And so I would say probably in the neighborhood of 60 to 75% of people we saw at the clinic for 10 years fit somewhere in that category. And they would show up and we would listen to them. And we would listen to them with this state of openness and knowing and curiosity. And of course, they would begin to flower. They would tell us things that they had never told anybody else, because they were closing in response to that sense of divided knownness that they were getting from so many other people. And when you live in that for so long, you close your heart, you close your world, your receptivity, and that's a terrible place to live. It's very isolating.
Well, it certainly, I would assume, leaves an individual feeling like they don't fit anywhere.
Yes.
Nobody understands them. There's certainly something wrong with them because they don't fit into anywhere.
Yes.
And they don't know that, 75 or more % of the people walking around them feel in very similar ways because they don't have a place to talk about it or a model to help them move from where they really are, which is having these gifts really.
Yes.
And what do you do with them, and how do you work with them, etc., etc.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you live in your body and your mind with that? Yes.
Exactly, because it's possible. It becomes like it has become like a curse in our system, but it's not because those gifts are wrong. It's because the system
That's right.
isn't a correct system.
Yeah, that's right. I think the system is eons behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we've seen lots of leaps outside the system, but the system itself, the way that it trains people, the expectations that it has for recovery or healing are in the dark ages
Mm-hmm.
in comparison to where humans are and what they're needing and what they're looking for as far as not only support, but opportunities for growth, which
I
is
would
really
agree.
what healthcare should do, right? It should support growth.
Yes, I've often, even in my work is about working with individuals whom I have the ability and the skills, etc., for one part of their wellness protocol. But my purpose isn't to keep people locked in to their imbalance. That's not my purpose. My purpose is to get them into a state of balance, give them tools so that they know what they're doing, they can self-correct, etc., etc., so I can work myself out of a job and maybe
Yes,
do something else,
yes,
because
yes,
it would be wonderful if and when that world has that awareness and sense of self-balancing, etc., etc. you
yes.
know let's shift into what's going on in the world today, because from my perspective, of course, none of us have ever seen anything like this before in the way of shaking massively. No matter what the issue is, it's still here's a shake and here's a shake, and what will be the next shake. And what I'm seeing is that what may have taken, 50 years to get humanity, I mean, we're talking humanity, to this level of awake awareness, looking up out of the sand, is maybe happening in a week,
Yeah,
because it is so massive. We
yeah,
cannot, there's hardly any place where you can hide your head and say everything's wonderful, because you're going to be pulled out of that soon too. So my hope is that during this shaky time, we can start building systems that are not in, dark ages. I don't have any hope that we need to transform the system that is. You're more in a system, and maybe that's, you have a different view there. But if we can start nurturing and growing the systems that really will support as everything else is shaken. What's your take on what's going on out there in your communities and world?
I mean, I think feels twofold to me. One piece of it, I think, is that for a while, the mental health community has been moving towards both individually and collective as systems. So what I mean by that is like individual practitioners in their silos, the kinds of training that they're getting and the kinds of work that they're doing. And then in systems, what I'm really talking about is kind of care facilities, like recovery facilities for alcoholics or for eating disorders, or places that you go to for trauma. So in both of those places, I think what's been happening is that this new understanding, particularly around the body and the nervous system, has become more commonplace. And so as a result of that, you're seeing many more people doing breath and body-based work combined with regular talk therapy, which honestly was not even happening very often, even 5 or 7 years ago, which is crazy. So it's still very new. And I've been watching it and hearing a lot of people get very excited about that newness. And I think it's good. And I also think that it's kind of like it's a piece of the pie, but people are still not seeing the landscape of the whole pie. And so it's kind of like we're taking existing systems and we're adding in these new things like yoga, for example. When I first started utilizing yoga in the therapy room, nobody was doing it. People thought it was crazy. And now everybody and their mother-in-law is incorporating yoga, but very few people are utilizing a yogic system in the way it was intended, which is very different aim, and actually aims towards taking apart personal psychology, not repairing it. And we are using things like mindfulness and yoga as tools to help shore up fragmented psychology. And although they can be very useful for that, they were never intended for that purpose. They were intended for the purpose of eliminating egoic psychology in order to get connected with a more transpersonal unified field of experience. And if you do that too early, which is happening all over the fucking place, because you now have all of these practices are so commonplace and people are being attracted. I get so passionate about this because people are being attracted to these as fixes. So I'm going to go on a 10-day meditation retreat. I've never meditated before. I'm going to go sit 10 hours a day in silence for 10 days. And all this past trauma that's contained in my body is suddenly going to come out. No one on the retreat is going to know what the hell to do with it. I'm going to come back. I have no therapist. I'm going to find a therapist. That therapist knows jack shit about meditation. So they're going to think that it's like I've just opened and now I don't know how to put it back together. The therapist doesn't have any connection with a meditation person who understands transcendent experiences. This is a disaster. And it's been happening for years. And I've been watching it happen for years. And to me, this is the reason why we need cohesion. And we need to do it with humility, not with this sense of one-upmanship, which is what I've been watching in these circles of spirituality erupting around somatics and then in psychology. I watched it in my own clinic. I hired people who were body workers, who were nutritionists, who were dietitians, who were acupuncturists, who were yoga therapists, and who were therapists. And there was this group think that I had to undo to be able to say every one of you is on an even playing field here. We are all using a collective model that would allow all of you to have your piece because they are of equal importance. And we haven't gotten there yet. It's still very hierarchical. And as long as it stays that way, there's still this competition going on. And no one is really fully served by that sense of competitiveness, not the client and not the practitioners.
I really hear what you're saying. That definitely had been going on, I think, in pretty much every system, because the cultures we have been in, this culture we have been in is really a systemic domination culture. Everywhere in the world. You could say systemic racism, you could say systemic patriarchy, you could say, but it's systemic domination in that value system. Whoever's on top is the winner, and it doesn't matter what it takes to get on top because it's allowed. It's that culture. But what's exciting to me, Bree, and it's first of all, hearing what you're saying is so in alignment to what I've been saying and been doing just in the last, I would say, 2 years, working with a group in our way of putting together that collective community, a collective community in which the values we all absolutely are aligned in the values, and we have different gifts to bring. And I've never seen that ability to be collaborative and to learn, and be collaborative and to learn, and be collaborative to learn within a female collective in the same way as it's happening now.
Yes.
And so I mean, you would fit perfectly in our community. We would love to help support you with a clinic, and then a clinic. And I mean, because you mirror who we are and what we stand for, and so you're a perfect match here. And you closed the clinic as a brick and mortar. So you have, I mean, your unique message is missing because you're holding that. And so where are you now in relationship to, are you, because right now brick and mortar probably wouldn't be working too much, which is okay, downtime.
Yes.
What do you see as the next step for you in starting to actualize that in its next form, that integrative therapy in its next form?
So I think it's kind of a couple different levels. Like, I think there's definitely room, and I know we've talked about this before, for a real true multidisciplinary healing protocol to be out there in a telemedicine platform. And there isn't that quite yet. And so that's something that I've been thinking about. And on a level up from that, or a more larger scale, for a while I've been wanting to affect legislation. Like, I would like to be working at the legislative level to be able to affect big change in the ways that training gets done for professionals, in the ways in which we build clinics that are based on a platform of inclusivity. And, you know, the platform that I created is just one. There will be other collective care models. But the one that I created over the last decade has all of the intellectual property that goes with it. And so it's really ready to go. And I believe that these models could be used in prison systems. You know, I think that they could be used in regular clinical health settings that are open to everybody. And I also think they could be actualized in more intensives. So over the last couple of years, I would say the last 4 or 5 years, once the model got very strong and we really knew what we were doing on an outpatient setting, I started taking these protocols that we developed and I started experimenting with more intensive interventions that looked different than the ones that are out there. So for example, now, if you have an eating disorder, and I'll just use that example because it's one I know so well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a population that tends to have very high recidivism rates. You know, people go to care over and over again and kind of have a hard time knocking it. And so there's 3 levels of care with an eating disorder. The highest level of care, other than hospitalization, which I won't talk about, but the highest level of care is residential. One step down from that is a partial hospitalization program, which is like 5 days a week, all day long. The next level down from that is called an intensive outpatient program, and that's usually 3 or 4 days a week, anywhere between 12 and 16 hours a week of care. One level down from there is like what we offered. It's regular outpatient care. And so you see a dietitian once a week, you see a primary care doctor once a month or every other week, depending on your plan. And you may see them in all different kinds of places, in all different locations. At our clinic, you saw them in the same place often. So I started experimenting with taking this intervention that I called both a dosing and integration method that I developed. And it was a way of taking an individual system in a small group setting and essentially dosing them like crazy, their nervous system, their mind-body connection, their food, their hormones, all of it, intensely at the beginning to try and create a different paradigm for their system to move into. And then over a period of time, allowing them to integrate that shift and then bringing them back in again. And so it would effectively change the way that we do intensive care. And it would allow for the natural rhythm and system of a person's body, mind, nature to take in as much as they could, to integrate in the ways they could, and then to be integrated and dosed again and again until their system was allowed to integrate and fully own whatever level of movement it was trying to move to. And you could do that over a short or a long period of time. And so that became very interesting to me in the last 5 years, because it was a completely new way of approaching what we've been just doing in these very old systemic ways that are working, but are only working for a certain percentage of people. So I think there's room for that too.
Yes, and what I've seen a lot of times in that healing arena, and I'm not in the mental health arena, but even in the work I do, that a lot of the protocols are more like some basic steps, but they're not, I'll use the word, deep and broad enough.
Yes.
To really impact change, but it keeps a person kind of like feeling like they're going to be well, and they're feeling like they're going to be a little bit better, but it's not a complete like get in there and make this shift that's necessary, because it's a multi-dimensional problem. No matter what it is, when we're off, it affects our physical, our mental, our emotional, our spiritual, the parts of ourselves.
Yes.
How is that, and eating disorders, it is huge. I know that just because I've read, not because I've been in that field, but I do know that. What about that? I know there's also, I am sure, levels of those who feel depressed, and what who did you see in your clinic? Were there mainly people who were getting into it, have been into it a long time? How did that work impact those who would call themselves depressed?
So I would say depression gets diagnosed and also experienced on kind of a continuum of expression. And so I think a lot of people come into a clinic like ours self-diagnosed as being depressed, and what they really have is a lot of grief. They have a lot of unfelt, unexperienced grief. And much of that connects to like a culture that doesn't allow for or understand how to process grief, or anger, which is so inexorably tied to an experience of grief. Because if you repress your anger, you repress your power, and then you feel depressed, repressed, and also full of grief. And often then there's another component that comes in with that, which is shame, because you know that you are burying who you really are. And we have a culture that kind of supports burying who you really are. It doesn't really strongly support being who you are. It supports conventionalizing fitting into who you're supposed to be. And we have, magazines, self-help gurus, coaches, psychotherapists. We have many, many people who will train us to be a better version of who we think we are in our brokenness. And to me, that is the complete recipe for disaster for depression and repression. Because what I try to do is unpack people from that place. And so we would often see people on this continuum of depression, and we would spend a lot of time deprogramming them and unpacking them from these belief systems that they either got from their families or the culture or other care systems, or the ways in which they had been over-exercising to become somebody better, or however it was expressed within their system. We would spend a lot of time softening and unpacking them and showing them this more yin energy, because all of that is very yang. And so we would hold them in a more yin place in order for them to be able to come into relationship with the aspects of them that had been so hidden and exiled and covered over by becoming so walled off and making them into this other thing that they weren't really. And oftentimes then depression was ameliorated within that process, because what you find in there is life force returning. And depression is often the extinguishing of life force.
I've often made the comment that in our civilized communities, that we have not experienced being in our own natural rhythm.
Yes.
And you think about a child is born, a baby's born, and maybe for a little while, a month or two or three, he's kind of running the show, and mom and dad kind of adjust to that. And then she is no longer running the show because mom and dad have to go to work. Baby has to get up at a certain time.
Yes.
Things have to be done to baby. Baby then goes into it doesn't matter, quality care center. Still, there's some regimented activities in order to keep order amongst the children, and what's the rhythm there. And then they're going to kindergarten, and they would really like to sleep in until like maybe 10, but they can't because they have to catch the buses. When
Yes.
have we ever had an extended period of time to get in touch with our own internal rhythm that it exists? And here we are in COVID.
Yes.
First of all, and for a little while, people are going, this is kind of good. And then all of a sudden, you're hit with the wall that, who am I? What am I? Hey, wait a minute, I need to be productive.
Yes.
I mean, it is huge, isn't it?
It is huge. It was interesting. My daughter my daughter's a pretty sensitive kid. And she was pretty dysregulated as an infant, as many sensitive kids are, because they come into this very incredibly intense world. And so she cried a lot, and we had a really hard time keeping her regulated. And when we sent her to school, we sent her to a very progressive, small, very fluid private school. And so she was able to find a lot of that rhythm. When she ended fourth grade, we pulled her out of that school because it wasn't meeting some of her needs anymore. And we sent her to public school, and within 2 months, it became an utter disaster. We pulled her out and we started homeschooling her. And Sharon, within that first year, she came alive. It was like she could get up when she wanted. She could make art when she wanted. She's highly creative. And so she was making art. She was drawing. She was singing. She was laughing. She was playing. She was interested and engaged. And she was taking more ownership for her own internal experience out in the world. She was more confident. And all of that was just because of what you're saying. Just because her natural ability to find what moved her and when she wanted to move and when she wanted to be still and how to regulate around that was able to happen inside of her. It was incredible. It was incredible. And I think we all need so much more of that.
I do too. One of the things, my hope is through this few months, and who knows how many months it will stretch, that we start to really own that the systems aren't working for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. And then we start looking for ways we can either create new, support new, be involved with new, and guard those as they start to pop their heads up. Because if we go, I think there is too much, this is my hope again, that there is too much awareness massively that we'll never go back to what was.
Mm-hmm.
But if in this time some of these new can start their foundationing,
yes,
and being aware of,
yes,
and so that others who are looking can find them.
Yeah, and I think it's going to really take, one of the things that it's going to take is more major backing. And so, I think like our clinic, we did it as a grassroots movement. I didn't have a lot of money when we started the clinic. I mean, it cost us a lot, but it was still a little in comparison to what it would be. You know what I mean? And I think somewhere there has to be financial backing for these things to really become more widespread. And what's ironic is that, right now, so much of healthcare is driven by insurance. So, much of the ways in which people practice is driven by how much they can get reimbursed, by how often they're allowed to be reimbursed. And somebody can either go to a higher level of care because insurance says yes or no. So in a case of an eating disorder, I might have somebody who's very ill and really needs a higher level of care, but their body weight is not low enough and they're not vomiting frequently enough. And so if that's the case, they may not qualify for a higher level of care. And that has gotten better, but it's still like that. So you're in essence saying to people, you have to get sicker to actually get this thing that you need. And so over the years, I've been talking here in Vermont with Blue Cross Blue Shield about the model that we developed and how they might really support that financially. And there's still this disjoint with them wanting what we call evidence-based practices. And so many of those practices, Sharon, they're the ones you spoke about a little bit, which is that they're management practices. They are not depth-oriented practices, because the things that work on the deeper level, we can't quantify and measure the same way. And once we try to quantify or measure them, they're invisible to us. They've gone away because there are too many forces that have too many aspects of power that are not able to be held by these constructs. And they require a certain amount of trust, and that we measure them from the level of how they are working for people in the ways they report it, not just in this system that looks the same for everybody. And so I think we tried to really ride that line, you know what I mean? Like do both, so that it wasn't so esoteric that it was outside the realm of insurance, but it also combined that element so that it wasn't so management oriented that it left out the esoteric and deep realms of consciousness that we know affect everything in the unseen world and give shape to everything that we see in the seen world. And so I think that's going to be a big leap. And I think that insurance companies and even backers like venture capitalists still feel very shy about backing those kinds of models. And I would like to be able to make that bridge so that people can understand why those models work and why not only will they work, but they'll save money.
Yeah.
Because they are more cost effective.
And they'll save lives.
Yes.
And they'll lead to more productive lives all
yes.
around.
Yes.
The thing that, and again, we get back to systems, don't we? And a system is really hard. It's really hard for a system to admit the system doesn't work. You know, it's really hard. But what's outside the system, but in our community, which is the Sacred Ground Collective community, we have started a whole new pillar called New Economy Intensive.
Yes.
And where we talk about complementaries, what's possible, new mindset, et cetera, which is really taking on. And one of the models we point to is Muhammad Yunus from Bangladesh. And Muhammad Yunus created the Grameen Bank for women in his country. That's a whole story. And now, but he's been working for, I don't know how many years. I will say maybe like 8 years now, with a model that he feels is the level up, and he calls it social business. And it is a model that says that what this business is all about is social good. And it is all about social good, and it's about treating employees well and treating them well too. And it has to be sustainable.
Yes.
But it is nothing about profit. There is no profit in it. There is keeping the business stable, keeping lives stable, both employees and those who they touch. And what he has had experience with is some of these larger companies who have come on board as venture capitalists, knowing they're not going to make a profit. They'll get their money back over maybe even a more extended time, but their employees have jumped on board with different projects. And to me, that is really heartening. It's not happening so much in the United States. We do not have a model for social business in the United States. Even nonprofit is not it. But I think what's going to be happening through conversations like what you and I are having, and are happening in coffee shops and in living rooms and on Zoom all over the place, is these ideas will emerge. And we'll say, okay, let's take that. Let's go with it, because that's where the new comes from. They come from conversations, always have. They always start like at the tip of the pyramid. You don't generate until you don't start with masses, you start with where you're at. And
Yes.
this is a critical need.
And as you're saying it, like, what comes up for me, Sharon, is that for me, I was running that kind of business, but on a platform that didn't have that underneath it. And so it's depleting for the business owner, even if you try to make it sustainable for the people who are in the company. And what I really recognized, and is particular to mental health, is that practitioners in the mental health, and actually in the healthcare field all over, it's not even just mental health, the level of burnout is so incredibly high because you are forced to see so many people in order to make a living. And you're forced to see them in this particular way that is very non-nourishing. And so the capacity is so low for practitioners, not because their internal capacity is low, but because they're really being depleted by the work over and over. Mm-hmm. And so one of our goals was to recognize that the people who worked for me were a customer, just the way the people who came in for care were customers. Mm-hmm. And that everybody needed to be nourished by the system that was created, not just the people coming for care. And so what did that mean to build a business that way? And so you could build it, but it was very hard to finance it because we still don't have the larger systems in place, as you're speaking about, that allow for that kind of financing. And so we did it on a reimbursement of about $70 an hour. Mm-hmm. And that is really low. Mm-hmm. And so, that was one of the things that as a business owner for 10 years is a problem I was really looking to solve, so that when I take this model to the next level, it's with that solution in place. Mm-hmm. And some of what's needed is these bigger systems to support businesses like that in a way that is circular.
Exactly. It's one of the things we point out in our intensive is here we are as women and we've been in the system that we call capitalism, which requires imbalance.
Yes.
And women have been a big part of that imbalance way, most of the time in the 60s kind of brought that to our attention. But here we've been trying to thrive in a system that requires that we not.
Yes.
And so then acknowledging it, that's what is, and it has a role to play, and what is that role? But then how do we begin to, like you say, design and foster and build a different kind of system that is saying everyone thrives and we thrive together and yes. we lift together. And what that will look like, we don't know yet, but if we can begin doing it in small places, yeah. so we can begin to anchor it and then share it. Otherwise, it's not going to start. But I really hear what you're saying. Yeah, that foundational piece.
Yes.
If we don't create a new system, we're not in a system that supports it.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's been a great conversation. I would hope that our listeners, when they can, listen in, that they walk away with knowing that, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not me.
Yes.
That yes, I've got my brokenness. In a system, a culture of systemic domination, we're all broken. We are all broken.
Yes, because it's all hierarchical.
It is, and so doesn't matter if we think that we're fine. We are still acting from some form of that inner brokenness, inner constructs, and that's what we bring to our in relationships. And so knowing that, it's like, oh, okay, where can I find then a different system? Because deep within, I know I'm okay, but how do I get there? And then how do I let that life force fill it? And then where am I supported in bringing it forth? A huge shift.
Yes. And I think that's what's driven, over the last number of years, we've seen so many more people move towards spiritual disciplines mm-hmm. in order to look for that level of healing. And I feel really encouraged by that happening. Like I obviously it's a very big collective movement that's happening there. And so I feel really encouraged by it. And at the same time, it still feels so divided.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really hope that I know actually that we are moving to a place where those divisions are starting to overlap so much more just in our language, in our understanding, and in the ways in which people are being more willing to look at the places in which, as you say, we've all been groomed into this culture and how it's playing out within us and within our communities.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
And I think another big thing is to say, don't look for the magic key.
Yeah.
There isn't
Yeah.
a magic key. There is a magic puzzle that's you,
Yeah.
and that magic puzzle is coming together, and then this helps it, and then this helps it. So everything you do helps it in some way, even if it's just like stabilizing you enough that no more pieces get broken.
Yes.
But it isn't a magic key. That's a trap. Keep your curiosity going and say,
Yes.
where is the next place that can bring me another piece of pulling me into me. So yes.
Yes.
Well, how can listeners stay in touch with you? I know we in our collective are going to stay in touch with you, and so I know they'll be able to access you through our systems of websites, etc. But what about you? How can they stay more in touch with you, or what would you need from our audience, Bree?
So Facebook, I have a Facebook page that's a professional one, which is just Bree Greenberg Benjaman, LMFT. And so that's a good place to stay up on whatever's going to be happening. I'm in the process of a new website. Their old one for VTCIT is still present, but it's really outdated. And so there will be a new one that's coming. And I've got a couple of different programs that I am toying with launching over the next couple of months. One of them is an actual eating disorder training, which is based on the eating disorder training that I've been doing for professionals for the last 6 years. So it's based on the model I created. It's not based on any other eating disorder model that's out there, and is very multidisciplinary and multimodal in its orientation and understanding. And so I'll be doing an online version of that for professionals. And then I will also probably be launching an intensive program for individuals who are looking to kind of dive in to addictions and eating disorders and would like to do that in an online platform too.
Okay.
And then from there, I'm not sure yet. I mean, my dream would be to find some really wealthy venture capitalist who thinks this is awesome and wants to make a collective care model happen in multiple places within the United States, and could help that come to fruition. But in the absence of that, I'll kind of keep chipping away at it.
Sounds wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us, and thank you for what it's taken for you to learn what you needed to learn to get to where you are now, because this didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without price on your end. And I just want to acknowledge that. And it's true for all of us. Whatever it is you're going through, it's part of that price you're paying in order to have something to give out into the world. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's not really something that a magic wand pops you on the head and there it is. So I call it experiential wisdom. It's powerful.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. Thanks for saying that, and thanks for having me.
Yes, and until we meet again. So listeners, if you share this with others, your friends will love it too. And if you want to be part of the Patreon community that for the Deep Roots, just go to www.patreon.com/mystic's view. So until we meet again.
Thanks, Sharon. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.